Good morning. As we come to the end of this chapter, as we come to the end of this prayer, we also come to the end of that last night that Jesus spent with his disciples prior to his arrest and execution. In the previous chapters, Jesus has shared a meal with them, he's washed their feet, he's given them the command to love one another, and answering questions concerning the fact that he is about to leave them. Following it all, with the end at hand, Jesus prays. It rather underscores how important prayer is, because the last hours that Jesus had with his disciples, the final moments before he went to the cross, ended in prayer. The one who understood prayer better than any other spent his time in intercession. Throughout the evening, Jesus has given his disciples as much encouragement and teaching as he could. He warns them about what is about to happen and how he will provide for them once he is gone. But now Jesus turns from offering information to them and begins to offer intercession for them. This move from information to intercession is important if we want to understand how to read John 17. In this chapter, Jesus is not giving commands to the disciples or we who will follow. He is praying. We need to read this text in light of what Jesus is doing. We need to be aware that at this point, he's not instructing, he's not preaching, he's not teaching or encouraging. Jesus is praying. That means that John 17 is not a list of demands that is placed upon us. It is a series of requests uttered on our behalf. This is important. We do not get to turn John 17 into a to-do list for the church. Instead, we need to see that here we are the subject of another's prayer. Now, I'm painfully aware of how much I need your prayers. And when I hear someone pray on my behalf, I can go through an array of feelings. At times I can feel comforted, other times humbled. I can feel vulnerable, sometimes simply a bit awkward, though appreciative. Regardless, and fundamentally, I am grateful. I am grateful in the knowledge that someone cares enough to do something so important, to pray. However, one thing to bear in mind, pertinent to this passage, is that when we are prayed for, we are not in control. It is not about us doing something. When people pray for us, they, not we, are the ones doing the asking. It is God, not we, who is doing the answering. If Jesus were teaching or exhorting his disciples at this point, and by extension ourselves, we would strive to meet his expectations. Instead, in John 17, we get to overhear a prayer on our behalf. And we're not called to action in that moment. Instead, our role is to wonder. To be in amazement as the Father and the Son spend their time discussing the likes of us. For make no mistake, as we see in the opening verse of our text, in those final moments, as death looms, Jesus prays for you and me. In verse 20, I do not ask only for these that is the disciples, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, which is all of us ever since. What this means then is that when this prayer is focused on unity and love, I am to remember that this is a prayer. I don't get to harangue you on the extent to which you're measuring up to these key themes. I kind of miss the point when I say, pull your socks up, be more loving, be more unified, because that then forgets that this is a prayer. It would also obscure what is revealed in the prayer, something far greater, far more glorious than a lecture on some supposed heavenly expectations. Jesus is very clearly praying for us. However, in order to understand what he is praying for, we need to see it in the context of the relationship between himself and the Father. So the request for unity, key here, and clearly a subject for the prayer, this unity amongst the believers, it is to be seen in the context of the Father and Jesus being one. That's what we see in verses 21 to 23. That they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I in them and you in me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you loved me. So here the unity between the Father and the Son is the centre of the prayer. It reminds us once again that even here the Bible is primarily about God, and it is only in relation to him that it then speaks to us. The call for unity amongst the believers is because this is a reflection of the unity of the Godhead. The people of God have always been called upon to be a reflection of God. It was to be the greatest witness to all of the nations. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were called upon to be different from the nations around them. One of the great contrasts to those around them is that they were to be a people that were to live a life based on love, the guaranteed love of God, rather than living a life that was in constant pursuit of a deity's validation. In the book of Exodus, they were a people who were the focus of the love of God. They witnessed this love in action as they are freed from slavery. And through that lens of love, they were declared to be the precious jewels of God in chapter 19, verse 5. In Leviticus, they were called upon to reject the idolatrous actions of the nations around them. They were instead to be a contrast to the rest of the world. They were to be reflections of God to the nations. The great theme in the book is that as a people they were able to enter into the presence of God and from there act as a reflection of him. As such, they would dress differently, they would eat differently, they would live differently. Each action designed to be a contrast to the world, and each act was a way of reflecting something of Yahweh, the Lord their God. It means that when you read the Levitical laws, we find that instead of an arbitrary list of things to do, we find opportunities for the people to act in a way that reflected him. That's why we frequently read, "For I am Yahweh your God," after many of the laws. This means that when we read in Leviticus 19, verse 14, where the people are told not to ridicule the deaf or trip up the blind, they're told not to do this because I am Yahweh your God. In other words, such action would have been the opposite of who he is. Instead of some sort of survival of the fittest, where such behaviour could be condoned, he demonstrates a concern for the vulnerable and an enmity towards those who would abuse power. In other words, cruelty is just simply not him. And as such, there is no room for such things amongst a people who would seek to reflect him. In the prophets, such as Isaiah 5 and verse 7, we see that the people were called to be a land of righteousness and justice because it would be the undeniable evidence that God was real, because it wasn't natural in the world. When this was clear, it would be a reflection. It would point the world to him, the one that makes such a change in us. The people of God were always called to reflect him, to be the evidence that he is real, that he really changes lives, to show him in all of his glory to a world in darkness. And this theme continued into the New Testament. We saw that previously in John 13, verse 35. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Something so striking, something so odd, points to someone making a difference. And in our passage today, it is the unity of the disciples in verses 20 and 23 that comes through as the way in which we are to reflect God to the nations. And this is because when we read of the unity of the Trinity, a lack of unity in the believers rather jars against the very truth of who he is. A lack of unity fails to accurately represent who he is. Now, at this point, it would be very easy to be distracted, to forget that this is a prayer, and then turn to you and say, well, you'd better be better unified. Now, you better all be pulling together in the right direction, or you're letting God down. It's easy, as I said, to turn the prayer into a list and to fail to grasp the enormity of actually what's being done here. You see, despite everything that happened in the Exodus, despite the miracles, despite the rescue, despite the way that God provided all that they needed, despite the value that he placed on them, the people failed to reflect him. As we see in Isaiah 5, verse 7, instead of the righteousness and justice of Yahweh being seen in the people, they instead just went the way of all the other nations, reflecting nothing other than the same bloodshed and cruelty seen elsewhere. When it comes to the unity spoken about in John 17, we should be mindful of the fact that the disciples were hardly a unified group. Now, we have examples of them vying for position and seeking their own interests first. Matthew 20, verses 20 to 28, describes in James and John, at the prompting of their mother, seek a greater position than the rest of the 10, and that caused all manner of ructions within the group. In Mark 9, 33 to 37, we see the response of Jesus when the disciples have been arguing all day over which of them was the greatest. And of course, lest we delude ourselves, what do you think would actually happen if we were left to our own devices? When it comes to reflecting God, of showing unity in our own strength, do we really think it would be any different? Called upon to be the evidence that God is real and really changes us, called upon to be a reflection of God, we too are to stand in the world as different, only all too often we are not. In our own strength, our best efforts, our poor imitation at best, we cannot live up to this calling, that calling to be a perfect representation. And that is why a list of things to do, a message of, be more unified, well, it's doomed. And that's why instead Jesus prays. He takes it out of our hands and away from our efforts. Notice what Jesus says when he prays. He does not simply say, let them be unified, let them agree with each other and pull in the right direction. He asks for something greater. You see, the unity of the Son and Father serves as the foundation for the unity amongst believers. Because, as we see here, Jesus is asking that we are drawn into the Trinity itself. Look again at what he actually says in verse 21. Excuse me. Verse 21, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. It is an idea that is repeated in verses 23 and 26. It's an idea that's expanded elsewhere in the New Testament. It's also reminiscent of John 15 verse 4 when Jesus said, abide in me and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Now, when we looked at that text back in September, I thought that perhaps the idea of us abiding in him and him in us could be slightly confusing. And I did wonder, how is it that we could grasp such a thing? Then at the time I recounted when I was a boy out in a fishing boat with my dad, who's trying to explain this idea to me. And to make the point, he threw a creel overboard and asked me where was the creel. And of course I replied, it's in the sea. And so far correct, he nodded and said, but where is the sea? Well, in part, it was now in the creel. And when we think of Christ as the sea and ourselves as a creel, now we find that if we throw ourselves into him, then he is in us and we are in him. And here that idea is taken to its logical conclusion. When we have God within us, we are in God. It is when we are immersed in him, have God really within us, that we become people who can reflect him to the world. It is through his power that we get to put on a new self, created in the likeness of God, able to live in true righteousness and holiness. That is the very message of Ephesians 4:24 and Colossians 3:10. We are only able to reflect him because the Creator has made us anew, because the author of life breathes new life into us. When Ezekiel was faced with that vision of the dry bones, it was God that brought them back to life. It was not due to the efforts of those scattered remains. And in the same way, it's not simply because we try hard enough or fulfill enough commands that sees us change this new life in us. Ultimately, we're called upon to be unified enough not to impress the world. We're actually called upon to be changed, so that because we are like him, and that unity flows through us with that same message and same God, it's not that we impress the world, but that we convict the world. We need to be so changed that there can be no doubt that God is real and really changes people. This, after all, is what we see in 2 Peter chapter 1. This is a text that I think particularly helps us understand what Jesus is talking about and how it should impact our life day to day, what role we have in all of this. When it comes to 1 Peter, it's important to know that from the opening verse, Peter has talked about how salvation is a gift from God. And from that point, everything that we do is in the power of God. There's nothing that we can do without him. There's nothing that we can achieve in our own strength. And it all comes to head in verse 4, when Peter then talks about the fact that we get to be partakers of the divine nature, hence the parallel with our passage this morning. Now, the point of this, when he talks about being part of the divine nature, is that if you've taken part in that, if you've been made a new person, if you have God living within you, there needs to be evidence of a change. You can't just be the same after such an encounter. You need to have the evidence of this great change, the evidence that Jesus considered vital to being a witness in this world. In Peter, we have a way of measuring the change. For in verses 5 to 8, there's a list of ways in which this change can be seen. We become a people that show some evidence of growing virtue and knowledge and self-control and steadfastness, godliness, brotherly affection and love. These are the things that should emerge if God is making a difference in our lives. And again, it's all too easy to make that into a list, a stick to beat yourself with. We find ourselves failing in one category or another or more, and so we are just simply laden with failure as we look at the list. But as Peter's been saying, there's nothing that we can do out with the power of God. That's the whole point of the opening verses of the chapter. If we look at these attributes as a list to be achieved in our own strength, we just create a burden that cannot be lifted. It is akin to telling a blind man that if he just opens his eyes a little bit wider, he'll see, or a cripple, telling him that he'll be able to leap if he just tries a bit harder. It'd be the same as telling those dusty bones in Ezekiel to simply move of their own accord. And that's why it's important that we notice a little thing in the Greek here. In 2 Peter, we have a rather beautiful analogy that actually helps clear this all up. Where we often read an impossible command in verse 5, usually something like, now add to your faith, it actually says in the Greek a little bit more accurately, now dance in faith. Having taken part in the divine nature, we now find this epikoreogio, which talks about taking part in a divine dance. This is how he wants to describe life, a metaphor as it were, to describe how it is that God does this change. Now, I'm not claiming any great prowess to dancing. However, I grew up dancing ceilidh since I was fairly small, and I've had the same partner in my wife Mary for well over 20 years. Now, I know her. I know how she moves. I know what she can do and what we can do together. And it's a very different experience dancing with her than when I am called upon to dance with somebody else. The more that we have grown to know each other, the better we dance, even as I get older and slower. I no longer stand on her toes or her dress. We no longer pull in different directions or collide awkwardly. And the reason I mention this is that the dance with God is not simply following some steps like a list, an entirely prescribed manner. The idea of it is that as you become comfortable in the dance with your partner, with God leading the dance, you move across the floor with greater ease and style. The better we know him, the better we can be like him. And the more we can be the people that we were meant to be. Which means as we dance through life with God, these things emerge, these qualities develop. We're no longer fighting against God, no longer pulling in different directions or colliding or anything else. We dance to a greater and greater extent. The more time we spend with him, the more of our life is spent in his hands, the more these things emerge. And it's important that we understand that it is God doing a thing in us because we are spending time with him, rather than a list of things that we achieve that somehow is there to impress him. We do not have a list of demands, of ways to try harder. We have someone who says, come dance with me. I will lead you, I will guide you. But if you really take part, if you really throw yourself into this, you will change. And change is needed. But change is possible. Change is by the hand of God, and we are called upon to take the hand to be led in his dance. In other words, we do not have a list of requirements, or to think back to John 17, a demand for more unity. Instead, we are called upon to take his hand and dance, to be changed, to become undeniable witnesses of what he does in a life and in a community. This is why it was important to start by noting that Jesus is asking for us and not asking from us. Our part in it all is to take his hand, to throw ourselves into the dance, and by spending the time with him, see over time the change that he brings in our lives. However, as we see here in John, the goal is not simply that I as an individual am changed, or even that we as a community are changed. But as we saw in John 17, it's outward looking. It acts as a way of demonstrating to the world that does not know God the evidence of who Christ is. And so we are the recipients of this prayer, so that we would indeed love with the love poured out by the Trinity, with God in us, dancing with us, and yet at the same time reaching out to the world. What a wonderful and amazing thing that is. And this morning we should be awed of who it is that holds out his hand and says, now, again today, come dance with me. Amen.